Strategies for deepening the mentor's dynamic. One repays a teacher badly if one remains only a pupil. Friedrich Nietzsche. Although you must submit to the authority of mentors in order to learn from and absorb their powers to the biggest degree, this does not mean you remain passive in the process. At certain critical points, you can set and determine the dynamic, personalize it to suit your purposes. The following 4 strategies are designed to help you exploit the relationship to the fullest and transform the knowledge you gain into creative energy. Number 1. Choose the mentor according to your needs and inclinations. In 1888, the 20-year-old Frank Lloyd Wright was an apprentice draftsman at the prestigious Chicago firm of Joseph Lyman Silsbee. He had been there a year and was learning much about the business, but he was getting restless. In his mind, he could already envision a totally new style of architecture that would revolutionize the field, but he lacked the experience to set up his own practice. Silsbee was a shrewd businessman who saw that his fortune was tied to staying true to the Victorian style of a design that was popular with his clients. Wright cringed at what he was being asked to draw. He was learning antique design principles that offended him. Then, out of the blue, he heard that the great Chicago architect Louis Civilian was looking for draftsmen to help finish the drawings for a particular building. It would be dangerous to leave Silsbee after such a short time and the burn of his bridge there. But working for Civilian would identify more stimulating for his personal development as an architect. Civilian's firm was at the forefront of designing skyscrapers utilizing the latest advances in materials and technology. Wright went on a charm offensive to secure the position. He managed to get a personal interview and showed Civilian some of the more interesting drawings he had done on his own. He engaged him in conversation about art and philosophy, knowing Civilian's own aesthetic predictions. So Sullivan hired him for the job, and a few months later made him apprentice draftsman in his firm. Wright cultivated a personal relationship with him, eagerly playing the role of the son that Sullivan never had. With his talent and Sullivan's blessing, he quickly rose to the position of head draftsman at the firm. Wright became, as he put it, the pencil in Sullivan's hand. In 1893, Sullivan fired him for moonlighting, but then Wright had learned everything he could and was more than prepared to step out on his own. Sullivan had given him in those 5 years an education in modern architecture that no one else could have provided. In 1906, Carl Jung was a promising 31-year-old psychiatrist. Renowned his work in an experimental psychology and holding an important position at the famous Burghausen psychiatric hospital in Zurich. But despite the apparent success in his life, he felt insecure. He believed that his interest in the occult and strange psychic phenomena was a weakness he needed to work through. He was frustrated that his treatment of patients was often not effective. He worried that his work had no legitimacy and that he lacked a certain rigor. He began to correspond with the founder of the psychoanalytic field, Sigmund Freud. 51 years old at the time, Jung was ambivalent about Freud. He admired, even worshipped him as a pioneer in the field. He did not like his emphasis on sex as determining factor in neurosis. Perhaps his aversion to the aspect of Freudian psychology stemmed from his own prejudice or ignorance. He needed to be overcome by talking it out. In their correspondence, they quickly developed a good rapport, and Jung was able to question the master about matters of psychology he didn't fully understand. A year later, they finally met in Vienna and talked non-stop for 13 hours. The younger man charmed Freud. He was so much more creative than his other faculties. He could serve as a successor at the psychoanalytic movement. For Jung, Freud could be the father figure and mentor he so desperately needed, a grounding influence. They traveled together to the United States, saw each other on frequent visits, and corresponded instantly. But some 5 years into the relationship, Jung's initial ambivalence returned. He began to find Freud rather dictatorial. He chafed at the idea of having to follow Freudian dogma. He now clearly understood why he had initially disagreed with the emphasis of sexuality as the root of all neurosis. By 1913, he had a definitive break. Jung forever banished from Freud's inner circle, but through the relationship, Jung had worked out all of his doubts and sharpened certain core ideas about human psychology. In the end, the struggle had strengthened his sense of identity. Without this mentorship, he would have never come such a clear resolution and became capable of starting his own rival school at psychoanalysis. Sometime in the late 1960s, V.S. Ramachandran, a medical student at college in Madras, came upon a book called Eye and Brain, written by an eminent professor of neuropsychology, Richard Gregory. For more on Ramadashan's early years, see page 32. The book excited him. The style of writing and anecdotes and the provocative experiences he recounted. Inspired by the book, Ramachandran did his own experiments in objects and soon realized that he had better suited for the field than medicine. In 1974, he was admitted to the PhD program at Cambridge University in visual perception. Ramachandran had been raised on stories of the great English scientists of the 19th century and the most romantic quest for truth that science seemed to represent. He loved the part that speculation played the great theories and discoveries of men such as Faraday and Darwin. He imagined it would be somewhat similar to at Cambridge, but to his surprise, the students and professors tended to treat science as kind of 9-to-5 job. It was competitive, cutthroat, almost cooperative environment. He began to feel gloomy and alone in a strange country. Then one day, Richard Gregory himself, a professor at Bristol University, came to Cambridge to give a lesson. Ramachandran was mesmerized. It was like something right out of the pages of Humphrey Davy. Gregory performed thought-provoking demonstrations of his ideas on stage. He had a flair for drama and a great sense of humor. This is what science should be like, Ramachandran thought. He went up after the talk and introduced himself. They had an instant rapport. He mentioned to Gregory an optical experiment he had been pondering, and the professor was intrigued. He invited Ramachandran to visit Bristol and to stay in his home, where he could try out the idea together. Ramachandran took up the offer from the moment he saw Gregory's house. He knew he had found his mentor. It was like something out of Sherlock Holmes, full of Victorian instruments, fossils, and skeletons. Gregory was precisely the kind of eccentric Ramachandran should identify with. He was communing to Bristol regularly experiments. He found a lifelong to inspire and guide him, and over the years he would come to adopt much of Gregory's style of speculation and experiment. Growing up in Japan in the late 1970s, Yoki Matushka felt like an outsider, as discussed in Chapter 1, pages 33 and 34. She liked to do things her own way in a country that esteemed social cohesion and conformity above everything else. When she decided to take up tennis seriously at the age of 11, she used the players John McEnroe and Andre Agassi as her role models. Consummate rebels in what they have been genteel sport. Later, when she moved to the United States and began attending university, she brought with her the same need to go her own way in whatever she did. There was a field no one was studying. It excited her. Following the instinct, she got into then exotic field of robotics and was admitted to the PhD program at MIT. There, for the first time in her life, she met someone on her own temperament, Rodney Brooks, professor of robotics at MIT, and the bad boy of the department. He was bold, taking on higher ups at the department and arguing against some of the most intrigued ideas in the field of artificial intelligence. He had developed a completely novel approach to robotics. It excited her that a professor could get away with such unconventional attitude. She began to spend as much time around him as possible, soaking up his style of thinking and turning him into her de facto mentor. He was not a teacher who told you what to do. He let you find your own way, including your own mistakes. But he would lend you support when you needed it. This style suited her need of independence. It was only later that she realized how much his ideas had gotten under her skin. Unconsciously following his lead, she would eventually create her own approach to robotics and pioneer a totally new field known as neurobotics. The choice of the right mentor is more important than you might imagine, because so much of her future influence upon you can be deeper than you're consciously aware of. The wrong choice can have a net negative effect upon your journey to mastery. You could end up absorbing conventions and style that don't fit you and that will confuse you later on. If she is too domineering, you could end up becoming a lifelong imitation of the mentor instead of a master in your own right. People often err in this process when they choose someone who seems the most knowledgeable, has a charming personality, or has the most stature in the field. All superficial reasons. Do not simply choose the first possible mentor who crosses your path. Be prepared to put as much thought into it as possible. In selecting a mentor, you will want to keep in mind your inclinations and life's tasks and future position you envision for yourself. The mentor you choose should be strategically aligned with this. If your path is a more revolutionary direction, you will want a mentor who's open, progressive, and not domineering. If your ideal aligns with more of a style that is somewhat idealistic, you will want a mentor who will make you feel comfortable with this and help you transform your peculiarities into mastery instead of ambivalent about your direction. It can be useful to choose someone who can help you gain more clarity about what you want, someone important in the field who might not fit perfectly with your taste. Sometimes the part of a mentor shows us is something we will want to avoid or actively rebel against. In this case, you might initially want to maintain a life more emotional distance than normally recommended, particularly if she's the domineering type. Over the time, you will see and absorb what to reject. Remember, the mentor dynamic replaces something of the parental or father figure dynamic. It is a cliche that you not get to choose the family you're born into, but you're happily free to choose your mentors. In this case, the right choice can perhaps provide you what your parents didn't give you: support, confidence, direction, space to discover things on your own. Space to discover things on your own. Look for mentors who can do that, and beware of falling into the opposite trap, poaching for a mentor who resembles one of your parents, including all of these negative traits. You will merely repeat what harmed you in the first place. Number 2, gaze deep into the mentor's mirror. Hokin Zenji, born 1685, died 1769, was born in a village near a town of Hara in Japan. His family on his father's side, coming from an illustrious line of samurai warriors. As a child, Hokin had the kind of relentless energy that would seem to mark him for a life dedicated to martial arts. But at around the age of 11, he heard a priest deliver a sermon about the torments of hell for those who were not careful. At this talk filled the young boy. And this talk filled the young boy with an intense anguish that nothing could extinguish. All of this tenacious energy was now directed towards doubts about his own worth, and by the age of 14 he decided that the only way to cool his anxiety was to pursue the religious path and become a priest. He was particularly attracted to Zen Buddhism, having read stories of great masters in China and Japan overcoming endless obstacles and suffering to reach alignment. The idea of passing through a phase of suffering accorded well with his innermost doubts about himself. At the age of 18, he was sent to a training center to prepare him for his life as a priest. The method of teaching, however, disappointed him. He had imagined 24-hour sessions of meditation and other ordeals. Instead, he was made to study all kinds of Chinese and Japanese texts. What he read and heard from his instructors did not change him at all. It was merely intellectual knowledge that had little connection to his daily life. His anxieties only increased. He left this temple and began to wander, looking for a mentor who would guide him. He entered one Zen school after another, and in every corner of Japan, he began to get a clear idea of the state of Zen instruction at the time. It revolved around simple sessions of seated meditation, with little instruction, until finally a giant bell would sound and the monks would hurry to eat or sleep. In their spare time, they would chant for happiness and peace. Zen had turned into one large orphic designed to lull students into a state of rest and lethargy. It was deemed too invasive, too overbearing to give enmant. Naturally, when given such free rein, they would opt for the earliest path, doing nothing. This This trend has spread throughout Japan. Monks everywhere had convinced themselves that Zen was easy and simple, and that whatever felt right was right. Occasionally, Hawking would hear of some school or prize that would creating a stir somewhere, and he would travel to see himself. In 1708, he spent weeks traveling to reach a temple at coastal town where just such a proactive priest was making an appearance. But after hearing a few sentences from his lips, Hawking felt the same profound boredom and disappointment. Quotes from texts, clever stories, all to cover up the deadness of the words. He began to wonder if it was time to give up, or if true alignment no longer existed. At the temple, he met another young monk who was equally disappointed with the talk of the priest. They became friends, and one day the monk mentioned that he had studied for a few days under a strange and competitive resultive master named Soju Rojin, who was not like any other teacher he had encountered. He lived in a hard-to-reach village, accepted only a handful of students, and was very demanding. This was all Hawking needed to hear. He asked for the young monk to guide him right away to Soju. When he met the master, he could see something in his eyes that was different from any other priest or teacher. He radiated power and self-mastery. You could read his expression, the pain he had endured to reach his current state. This man had lived and suffered. Hawking was delighted when Soju said that he would accept him as a pupil, but his excitement soon turned into fear. During their first personal interview, Soju asked him, "How do you understand the koan?" which is a Zen anecdote designed for instruction about the dog and the Buddha nature. "No way to lay a hand or foot on that," Hawking replied, imagining that was a clever response, at which Soju reached out and grabbed his nose, pushing it with harsh twist and yelling in his face, "Got a pretty good hand on it there." He held on tightly for several minutes, giving Hawking a fear of utter paralysis. Over the course of the next few days, he endured more and more abuse. Soju made him feel that all of his studies and traveling taught him nothing. He could not say or do one thing right. Out of nowhere, he could receive a blow or glob of spit in his face. He began to doubt every element of his previous knowledge and lived in complete terror of what Soju would do next. Soju gave him a series of the most difficult poems Hawking had ever heard to ponder and discuss. He could not make heads or tails of them. His feelings of digestion and demoralization were reaching a breaking point. But knowing what persistence was important, he kept it day and day, night and day. Soon he had doubts about Soju himself and entered thoughts or leaving him near future. One day, feeling particularly agitated, he wandered into a nearby village, and without knowing why or how, he began to contemplate one of the thorniest koans Soju had given him. Deep in thought, he stayed into the garden of a private house. The woman who lived there yelled at him to leave, but Hawking seemed obvious. Thinking he was a madame or bandit, he attacked him with a stick, knocking him hard to the ground. When he came to minutes later, he suddenly felt different, and he finally penetrated to the core of Soju's koan. He understood it from the inside out. It was alive within him. Everything fell into a place, and so he was certain he would finally reach alignment. The word appearing to him in a total new guise. He began clapping his hands and screaming in delight. For the first time, he felt the weight of all of his anxieties lifted from him. He ran all the way back to Soju, who recognized right away what happened to his pupil. This time, the master was gentle with him, stroking Han's back with his fan. He finally revealed to his pupil his thoughts. From the first time they had met, he had recognized in Hawking the necessary ingredients for true learning. He was fierce, determined, and hungry for alignment. The problem with all his students, he said, is that they would inevitably stop somewhere. They hear an idea and they hold on to it until it becomes dead. They want to flatter themselves that they know the truth, but a truth that never stops, never congeals into such truths. That is why everyone must consistently be pushed to the abyss, starting over and feeling their utter worthlessness as a student. Without suffering and doubts, the mind will come to rest on cliches and stay there until the spirit dies as well. Not even alignment is enough. You must continually start over and challenge yourself. Soju had faith that Hawking would continue this process because he was tenacious. Zen was dying throughout Japan. He wanted Hawking to stay with him and serve as a successor. He believed the young man would someday be responsible for reviving the religion. In the end, however, Hawking could not tame his restlessness. After 8 months, he left Soju, certain he would return as soon as he could, but the years went by. Once again, he fell into doubts and anxieties. He wandered from temple to temple, experiencing conjugal highs and lows. At the age of 41, he finally had his ultimate and deepest moments of alignment, bringing with it a mindset that would not leave him for the rest of his life. At this point, all of his ideas and teachings of Soju came back to him as he heard them yesterday, and he realized what Soju was the only true master he had ever known. He wanted to return and thank you, but the master had died some 5 years earlier. His way to repay him was to become a teacher himself, keeping alive his master's teaching. In the end, he was indeed Hawking, who rescued Zen's practice from the decay he had fallen into, just as Soju had predicted. To reach mastery requires some toughness and a constant connection to reality. As an apprentice, it can be hard for us to challenge ourselves to our own in the proper way to get a clear sense of our own weaknesses. At the times we live and make this even harder. Developing discipline through challenging situations, perhaps suffering along the way, are no longer values that are promoted in our culture. People are increasingly reluctant to tell each other the truth about themselves, their weaknesses, and their inequalities, flaws in their work. Even the self-help books designed to set us straight tend to be soft and flattering, telling us that we want to hear we're basically good and we can get what we want by following a few simple steps. It seems abusive or damaging to people's self-esteem to offer them stern, realistic criticism and then set them tasks that will make them aware of how far they have to go. In fact, this indulgence and fear is hurting people's feelings far more abusive in the long run. It makes it hard for people to gauge where they are to develop self-discipline. It makes them unsuited for the riders of the journey of mastery. It weakens people's will. Masters are those who by nature have suffered to get where they are. They have experienced endless criticisms of their work, doubts about their progress, setbacks along the way. They know deep in their bones that it's required to get the creative phase and beyond. As mentors, they alone can gauge the extent of our progress, the weakness in our character, the orders we must go through in advance. In this day and age, you must get the sharpest dose of reality that is possible from your mentor. You must go in search of it and welcome it. If possible, choose a mentor who is known for supplying this form of tough love. If they shy away from giving it, force them to hold up the mirror that will reflect you as you are. Get them to give you the proper challenges that will reveal your strengths and weaknesses and allow you to gain as much feedback as possible, no matter how hard it might be to take. Accustom yourself to criticism. Confidence is important, but it is not based on a realistic appraisal of who you are. It is more grandiosity and smugness. Through the realistic feedback of your mentor, you will eventually develop confidence that is much more substantial, worth possessing.